I do really want to thank the U.S. Department of Energy. I may have been hard on them in the past, but boy, lately they've really been coming around big time for the advanced reactor community, not just for our company, but for a lot of others.
How would you say things have changed over the last 5 years?
In 2012, we had a single large integrated research project, the solid fuel variants of molten salt reactors, but DOE wasn't spending any money on liquid fueled systems. The Department of Energy is also now investing in both solid fuel and liquid fuel. It's directing its funding specifically towards molten salt reactors. Founded a campaign on molten salt reactors, so they're actually working on molten salt reactors again.
National and international efforts to develop new sources of carbon-free energy are exploring a reactor concept first introduced in the 1950s and 60s. The Molten Salt Reactor.
Oak Ridge is the lead laboratory for the Molten Salt Reactor campaign, but there are many, many contributors. Office of Nuclear Energy is facilitating a lot of collaboration between the different national laboratories. That research is ramping up very quickly.
I attended a talk yesterday where they mentioned the technology working group meetings that took place in the summer of 2016 as a turning point for the department's interest in this technology space. When the Department of Energy people saw the enthusiasm, the diversity, the excitement around molten salt reactors, there really was a change that took place, and I have seen the ramifications of that change since then.
A number of other companies have come out publicly that they are working on molten salt reactors and trying to develop them.
There are at least 10 different salt mixtures that are proposed.
I'm looking from an operator perspective. If I need a new component for your machine, you're the only one who can deliver me the concept of the design. I can order fuel from Westinghouse, from Atom, which is standardized. I can order components which are standardized, but when I look at your designs, they're all different. You see this as a risk.
So with your LWR technology, everybody who's making LWRs is actually much closer in their concepts to one another than even any two of the MSR concepts are to one another. The nuclear industry is beginning to realize the diversity of concepts possible within the molten salt space. I mean, there is a huge design space there. For a long time, I think people have thought the molten salt is just one of the things you can do with nuclear without seeing it's almost like a whole new alphabet you can write with. So I don't think it should come as any surprise that there is a diversity of concepts. It would be akin to going back to 1962 and saying how many people can build PWRs.
So conclusion, it's a risk.
It is a risk, but I would also say if you're in the PWR business, you're already in quite a bit of risk to begin with. You know exactly what you're getting when you get an LWR. You're getting a pressurized machine that's going to make electricity and that only, right? It's not going to do other missions.
The marketplace is going to be brutal. Several of us are not going to be here in 5 years.
Different fuels are going to get weeded down.
And frankly, it's not that complicated to make that salt. So once you have a market that wants a lot of it, you'll get multiple players and you'll be able to buy it from multiple sources.
I kind of see this entire field as the computer or the PC industry in the early 1970s. There were a few startups and none of them had money. But when there was a breakthrough, everything moved fast and they all won. I think we can all win. So I'm not too afraid of that.
Can I say something about that real quick?
No.
I was going to agree with you. I think the analogy to the early 70s computer is very, very good. You know, in the early 70s, when people were talking about computers, you had big industry players like IBM saying, what on earth would anybody want a personal computer for? And to be brutally honest, they were right. They could not see from the things they did with computers why on earth any regular person would ever want to manage massive databases or input enormous amounts of financial information or anything like that. They weren't wrong. They just didn't see a market that somebody like Steve Jobs could see. He saw people typing documents. Oh, we got a typewriter for that. He saw people keeping track of appointments. Oh, I have a little notebook for that. The truth was none of those things by themselves was enough to get you to buy a PC. But the aggregate of all of those things, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, was finally enough until a very important thing happened in 1995 when people had email and could send letters to girls.
We're all sort of convinced that molten salt reactor is the way forward, but I feel like there's a different spectrum on the use of thorium in molten salt reactors. So I want to hear your view on why you want to use more or less thorium.
Being from Thorcon, thorium converter, thorium is part of our name. It's also key to public acceptance in Indonesia. Thorium is viewed differently than current nuclear reactors, so it gives you the opportunity to have a conversation with somebody without them having a very strong opinion when you start the conversation. In truth, for the neutronics, it's a thermal reactor, so thorium is nicer that way, and it does produce less plutonium. That doesn't mean zero, because we got to meet with the low enriched uranium requirements, so we've got U-238 in there. We can make it work either way. If I was a pure scientist, I'd say it doesn't matter, but it's not pure science, it's also politics. The most important thing about a new reactor is not that it's radically different, not that it uses the least amount of fuel, not even that it produces the least amount of waste. In the developing world, it's cost. Number 2 is cost. Number 3 is cost. You have to be safe, but after that, it's pure cost. So you got to look at the whole reactor design to say, well, what is your total cost when you're done? And I think we can make a decent case that an MSR, either pure uranium or with a mix of uranium and thorium, does work well for cost. Okay, and from my vantage point, I don't need reprocessing now. I need cheap power plants now, and build them before they build those coal plants, and then we'll have the money to do the rest.
Why not build the molten salt reactor? And once you have earned your first billions, then you can probably talk to the politicians. And then maybe you will be able to deploy something using thorium, which has a better neutron economy or had a better reactor economy, but you need some incentive. And today we don't really see the incentive. We just see a lot of obstacles to it.
Why am I using thorium? Because I want to eliminate the production of transuranic waste. I want to maximize the use of a resource that can last for billions of years, and I want to produce key medical radioisotopes that can only be produced in that way.
Personally, I don't actually think you should use thorium in a molten salt reactor unless it's a breeder. I think the whole point of thorium is to achieve breeding.
And to achieve a conversion ratio greater than 1. So I'll bet that's Thomas. Yeah. I didn't even have to look to know it was Thomas. If you are below a conversion ratio of 1, then you are just reducing the amount of enrichment that you need, and you're only reducing the amount of plutonium. There's a stepwise effect that happens at 1. So quite personally, if I was working on molten salt reactors that were not breeders, that did not have a conversion ratio of 1 or greater, I wouldn't put thorium in them. I would run them on uranium. I mean, thorium's just displacing U-238. So if you got rid of the thorium, you could run 5% enriched and be good. Right?
I run about 2% enriched if I have no thorium
There
in
you
there.
go. I mean, so what is thorium doing for you?
Well, it breeds better in a thermal spectrum than uranium-238
But it
does.
doesn't breed well enough.
It doesn't breed well enough to get to no fissile needing to be imported, but it breeds better, and it produces less plutonium. Most important to me is the public relations aspect.
If you're using uranium-plutonium fuel cycle, uranium's easy to play around with because it's very low radioactivity. Plutonium is very difficult to play around with at a university level because, well, it's plutonium, and they won't be letting you play with that. On the other hand, thorium and uranium are both earth-abundant, low radioactivity materials. And all you care about is the chemistry at a university level.
As a person from academia, where could we find common ground? What are some common needs that we could all look at?
If you ever got fuel salt spilled without a containment, what is the volatility of the cesium and the iodine? There's a lot of speculation that it simply won't go anywhere. If that turns out to be true and provably true, that makes a big difference.
We're working on it.
Good. Lars is absolutely right. At the university level, we could be testing things like cesium and iodide because, again, we can go and get natural, non-radioactive versions of both of those guys. All we care about is the chemistry. So all these chemistry questions that we have that are essential can begin to be addressed at the university level. I've come a couple of times to Abilene to see Rusty's work.
We just got back from Penn State and saw the great setup they had there. We've gone to University of Wisconsin, we've gone to University of Utah. So what do we need? We need students coming out that have played with salt before. You know, that'd be great. And this doesn't have to be fluoride salt. You can actually get your hands dirty with cheap salts like carbonate salts and nitrate salts that you can, you know, just, man, if a student came out that had already melted some salt and maybe done just even rudimentary electrochemistry or anything with them, that person would already be way ahead of most of the people who are saying, can I go work for you, who've never played with this stuff at all.
If someone was younger than myself and finds molten salt reactors to be a topic of interest, how should they proceed?
first, just get your technical chops. The whole realm of the STEM disciplines. Most nuclear engineering programs do an awful lot of math and an awful lot of physics. Yeah, you need those. But in a molten salt reactor, I mean, the things that you see a little bit differently for us, a little bit more physical chemistry, a little bit more metallurgy.
Electromotive series is used for the extraction of all kinds of different things in the metallurgical world. It has been considered for nuclear reactors, for molten salts, but I don't really think it has been quite taken to its logical extreme yet. Applying successively different levels of voltages to the salt. Last week I was at Penn State talking with their chemists about this whole idea of an electromotive series and the extraction of individual elements from fission products. And one of the young researchers there got very excited, and he said, you know, I've been thinking about this for years, and I've been thinking about how can we turn everything from the fission reactor into a useful product stream. And it was like we were having a meeting of the minds there. You know, I said, yeah, I've been thinking about the same thing. Almost anything you can think of, if it's all mixed together, is pretty worthless. You know, if I go mix M&Ms and Chex Mix and rice and beans and half a dozen other things from my pantry in a big pile, instead of being useful, now they're all of a sudden worthless. So the only thing to do with that mixture is scoop it up and throw it in the trash can. But in my pantry, binned in nice little individual compartments, every single one of those is useful. So in fission, all of these elements arrive to us in the pile, so to speak. They're all mixed together. Can we, from that, extract them back into individual bins, in which case each one of them would be valuable? And I believe that that will be possible. Fluoride salt technology will be the most straightforward way to do it.
I heard some mentions of chloride salts, and there are things that chloride salts would be great for. They're great for fast spectrum operation. But if you're going to go thermal spectrum operation, you can't beat the fact that fluorine itself has the highest electronegativity of anything else. So you can force everything in the world to want to be a fluoride. You can't do that with everything else, particularly oxides. Oxides are more electronegative than chlorides, but fluorides are more electronegative than oxides. So you can take spent fuel and take it chemically favorably all the way to a fluoride salt. And that's pretty darn important because we do have an enormous amount of spent fuel out there that's got to be addressed. So thanks to the hard work of people like Sid, there has been an establishment of the materials compatibility of three very important classes of materials from the molten salt reactor experiment. Fluoride salts, graphite, and Hastelloy-N. We know these three work together. One of the reasons that we feel very comfortable with proceeding on this technological foundation is because of this. There's other ways to go, of course. There's other moderators, there's other salts, but these are the three we know work, and we know they operate in a state of basic thermodynamic equilibrium with one another. So that is a very comforting thought as you proceed forward into the future of molten salt reactors.
We need uranium-233 to start a truly efficient thorium reactor. There's just no two ways around it. There are two inventories of uranium-233 in the United States. One is at Oak Ridge and one is at Idaho National Laboratory. We have been at it for many years to try to preserve these inventories, and progress is being made. But the other great thing about these inventories is these are also going to be the sources of radioisotopes for medical therapies, for targeted alpha therapies, as I mentioned earlier. As we proceed with the potential rescue of these inventories, there are benefits that could span worldwide from this.
This is our current concept with the liquid fluoride thorium reactor of Flibe Energy. It fully embraces the idea that we're going to do chemical processing. And I hear people talk about proliferation, I hear this kind of stuff. There are countries that already have nuclear weapons. Dealing with chemical processing doesn't change the fact that these countries continue to have nuclear weapons. The United States is not going to suddenly become a country that possesses nuclear weapons. We've got them. So does Russia, so does China, so does several other countries too. So I think there's a phrase that should be employed that has to do with fissile security rather than proliferation. Proliferation happens to countries that don't have nuclear weapons and get them. It doesn't happen to countries that already have them. The fuel that the thorium molten salt reactor runs on, uranium-233, was investigated and rejected for nuclear weapons over and over and over again by the countries of the world. So we have almost 80 years of history to go on now that people could have used this for nuclear weapons and didn't.
If a country wants nuclear weapons, they have many, many, many different ways to get them, a whole lot easier than that. It is going to make no difference whatsoever whether or not we build a thorium reactor.
I have gone and talked to the IAEA, I've talked to these people. The whole thing is safeguards. They want to know where is your nuclear material, how many significant quantities might be present in your uncertainty, And that has to do with how you monitor that. And that's where a chemical processing system actually works to your advantage, because it helps you know what's in there and be able to query the salt. You are going to have some kind of chemical processing system in any MSR just to keep impurities out, just to keep oxides and sulfides out. So it's not like
we can say, well, we can build molten salt that has no chemical processing. You're going to have some chemical processing. You might have a minimal setup, but you will have it.
You remember the fuel cycle study? They scored every reactor the same. They said every reactor basically we consider to be equal.
And if that's the DOE and NNSA saying that, I think we can take that as authoritative from the US side.
There are many countries that have successfully utilized chemical reprocessing of nuclear fuel that do not have nuclear weapons, as I would hasten to point out, such as Japan and Germany. You can do chemical processing of nuclear fluids, and it has nothing to do with proliferation. If a country wants to have nuclear weapons, they're going to go get them, and they're sure as heck not going to use a molten salt reactor to get them. They're going to build a graphite, natural uranium pile just like everybody else did, or they're just going to enrich uranium to highly enriched levels. But they're not going to go and surreptitiously rob a reactor to obtain materials for nuclear weapons. It's just, I'm sorry, it's just absurd. Here's something else I feel very strongly about. We have got to be able to do more with nuclear reactors than just make electricity. We all have these fun little boxes in our pockets now. We don't have them because they're great phones. We have them because they're fun little computers that just happen to be able to do what phones also used to do.
We've got to be the same way with reactors. We can't just make electricity. We've got to do a lot of things. There's too many ways to make electricity in the world. We've got to be into medicine, we've got to be in electricity, heat, water, and a whole bunch of other things that we can't even talk about here. And so our concept for the liquid fluoride thorium reactor that we're going to develop gets into using waste heat, using the gamma radiation, process heat, the thorium supply, fission products, fissile startup. All of these map together into different industrial engagements, both with national programs, medical radioisotopes, heavy industries, and the traditional electricity.
The reactor has a lot of applications, and the technologies that are being developed to enable that reactor also have spin-offs into other applications. Since you have a liquid fuel, you can really put whatever you want into that fuel in order to produce products. One of those might be medical isotope production. Currently, the main focus is on the introduction of thorium into that fuel cycle so that you can inbreed uranium-233 to continue the reactor as a thermal breeder. But the opportunities to introduce other things into either a blanket or directly into that salt are there for production of other isotopes of interest.
We do things in the reactor to ensure that thorium will turn into uranium-233. Rather than going down other paths like the formation of protactinium-234, uranium-234. But after fission, though, we can't really control it after that point. It's a statistical distribution of materials that emerge from the fission reaction.
But you have fission products that you could leave in the reactor, or you can pull out as quickly as possible.
Various steps will change the way fission products would otherwise evolve. One of the most important of those would be the removal of noble gases. Krypton and xenon are rather significant portions of the fission product distribution. If you remove them from the reactor, which is very easy to do in a molten salt reactor, that gas just comes out of the salt, then that changes how they would have otherwise decayed into other fission products. We can imagine right now a 1,000 megawatt nuclear reactor. It doesn't even matter what kind of nuclear reactor it is. That reactor is going to make approximately $500 million a year of revenue on the sale of electricity, plus or minus some, but that's fairly approximate. So depending on how much that machine cost, we can do in our head the mathematics of how long it will take to pay it back. If that machine costs $10 billion and it makes $500 million a year, it would take 20 years just to pay the thing off, even if running it costs nothing at all. So there are a lot of human efforts that are a lot more profitable than that. There's a lot of things people invest in that promise returning your money a whole lot faster than the energy industry, than the utility industry. And things that are promising faster profits tend to attract more investment. So even though we all benefit from the use of electricity, even though we're all grateful for electricity, it's gotten to the point where it's a marginally profitable industry, much like the airline industry. And thus, it doesn't attract an enormous amount of investment. It certainly doesn't attract much risky investment. It doesn't draw in the serious risk takers out there. They will go and generally invest in other things. And because it hasn't traditionally attracted an awful lot of innovation and risk taking, I think that's why we still have pretty much the same power strategies and power technologies we've had for 50 years. I mean, you could go back in time 50 years and by and large, an engineer 50 years ago would recognize your average power plant today. He'd walk into a coal plant or a nuclear plant and he'd go, oh yeah, I know what I'm looking at. Even a combined cycle natural gas plant, which is pretty new, would still be fairly recognizable to an engineer. He'd go, wow, this is impressive, this is better than what I've seen, but it wouldn't be something outside of his realm of understanding. It wouldn't be shocking to him. If he saw a field of solar panels or a windmill, he'd still say, oh yeah, I know what I'm looking at. That's because these fields haven't changed very much. Whereas if you took a computer hardware expert from 1968 and you brought him to today and showed him a server farm or an Amazon Web Service, he would have absolutely no idea what he's looking at. I mean, it would just be complete and totally different and revolutionary. So why has that technology progressed so far in 50 years while energy generation technology has not proceeded very far in 50 years? I would say a big part of it has been because one of these categories has promised much higher profits to its investors than the other one has. Making coal or nuclear better didn't seem to be a path to revolutionary profits, not in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, zeros, or now. So thus it has not attracted a lot of resources to bring about innovations. I would say that a lot of the people who are in advanced nuclear now probably didn't get into it thinking, I'm on my way to massive profits. They probably got into it because they were on a more personal quest to do something very significant for the future. I would put myself in that category. Nevertheless, when you go and talk to financially oriented people, investors, you're competing against other places for their money to go that do promise far more dramatic profits. So you have to come up with a better scheme. And I'm just pointing out that generating electricity just on first principles is not a terribly profitable way to go.
I think a lot of people believe that there's going to be a price put on carbon.
I think in the long run, the cost of energy will go up, but probably within the next 10 to 15 years, I don't think we're going to have radical increases in the cost of energy for the simple reason that, particularly in North America, we have large carbon fuel reserves. We have gas, we have coal, we have oil. It's simply the public's taste whether or not we will go exploit these resources. The appetite or the stomach for carbon tax has just not been there, and I don't predict that's going to change anytime soon. So I think particularly for people in the nuclear industry that are hoping for more expensive energy in the future to make nuclear a more competitive approach, they're wishing for something that I just don't think is going to happen anytime soon.
I personally wish there was a carbon tax, but I don't think it's going to happen either.
Well, do you believe that the carbon tax is even practical?
It can be effective in how it's implemented, but can you campaign on a carbon tax?
And then you run for re-election and your competitor goes, boy, that dirty dog, he implemented a carbon tax. Throw him out, give me his job, and I'll get rid of that carbon tax.
That's kind of why I worry about politics today.
That's pretty much what happened in Australia, exactly.
It's kind of like taxing water. The taxing things that everybody needs, and that impact the less affluent more than the rich people.
Exactly.
It's hard to do.
You can make an argument that energy taxes are actually some of the most regressive taxes there are because they disproportionately hit people that spend more of their income on energy rather than the wealthy that spend a rather modest fraction of their income on energy.
The thing about technology is that if you can advance technology, it's going to stay advanced. You might not have the same foothold you did before, but it's like if you implement the carbon tax, it's like someone else and they'll shut down the carbon tax. It's not even a permanent win. The carbon tax might indirectly advance some technologies, but it's not the most direct win as technologies that'll produce low carbon energy inexpensively.
Yeah, I tend to think that we are going to have to make the low carbon option the most economic option to have any hope of going forward. We're not going to be able to count on carbon tax or carbon fees to level the playing fields, as is fond of being said. I think we're going to have to work towards a situation where a company or utility says, I'm going to choose that option because it's actually the cheapest for me. And the fact that it's no carbon is just, it's nice. But that's not why they did it. They did it because it was actually the most cost effective. I see a lot of people claiming that that's where wind and solar are getting. I don't believe it. I think they're making an awful lot of assumption in there. The biggest one being that the grid will continue to be their battery, which is the biggest subsidy of all. And that will become progressively more and more difficult as we have more and more intermittent, unreliable energy like wind and solar on the grid.
I'm an engineer, and I used to be in love with wind and solar. I did a lot of looking into it, a lot of studying, a lot of reading, but I can also run the numbers. And I think a lot of the people who look at wind and solar don't. I came to the conclusion it wasn't good for the environment. It wasn't the resources that it takes to build solar panels and windmills. These aren't renewable. The rare earth magnets, the steel, the concrete, the fiber, all these sort of things. I mean, they are going to end up in a landfill at some point. There's no recycling plan for these sort of things. And so I really came to the belief that these things aren't good for the environment. They've got great PR, but they're not good for the earth. Mm-hmm. And I kind of had almost this revulsion against them at some point where I now feel very, very strongly that what a lot of people believe just isn't so. Mm-hmm. That these technologies are not something that I'm hoping grow. I don't want a wind and solar powered future. I'll be brutally honest. I don't. I want a thorium powered future. It really frustrates me that the nuclear story has such terrible public relations and the alternative has such good public relations, and in both cases it's not merited. I'm an engineer to my guts. I love engineering. I love all that kind of stuff. But the longer I'm in this thorium effort, the more I realize that the engineering, it's a part of the challenge, but it's not the biggest part. It's probably not even by 50% the biggest part. The biggest challenge is hearts and minds. The biggest challenge is being able to reach out to people who don't know about this and to be able to help them understand and to replace perhaps images in their mind now that are very negative associated with the future, with energy, with nuclear energy, and to replace them with hopeful images of how things could be. I think a lot of us are here because we have those hopeful images in our mind. How many of you are hopeful about the future? How many of you think that the next generation will have it better than we do? Great. I am so glad to see that. Good. We are what Weinberg would call techno-optimists. I saw something kind of depressing. I was in the airport last night. I saw this section in the bookstore called Science, Dystopian, and Fantasy. And I just turned to my wife and I thought, oh my goodness, if we come to the point that it's a section in the store, it's like, you go back to the 50s and it was loaded with techno-optimism. You couldn't pick up a book without reading about have rocket will travel, or we're going to go to other worlds and we're going to do awesome stuff and we're going to have this very, very bright, exciting future. And people responded to this. They responded to these images, these pictures in their minds of how things were going to turn out and how things were going to be different. And then in the 60s, it was as if fantasy became reality. We had people walking on the moon. We had giant rockets to other worlds. We had this incredible flourishing of techno-optimism. We had Sid Ball working on the Molten Salt Reactor at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. It's almost as if the 60s were a decade of the 21st century that had been ripped out of the future and inadvertently stitched in to the middle of the 20th century. And then something happened, and I don't know what it was, but I think it happened in about 1969, which was 5 years before I was even born. But it's as if we came to this moment of peak optimism. And I just can't figure out why we went from this decade of incredible enthusiasm and optimism about the future to almost a malaise that I feel like we haven't quite shaken in the 50 years since. It might have been the moment that Sid turned off the Molten Salt Reactor experiment. That might have been the moment when it happened. By the way, I mean, how cool is it Here's a guy in his 20s who gets to take the MSRE supercritical, and his boss says, that's cool. That's cool. Don't worry about it. Oh, goodness. I mean, nowadays, if it's like you trip and fall at a nuclear power plant, it's front page news across the world. It's just such a crazy overreaction. So I think that we need to work hard on getting positive images out there into the world of what the future could be like. And the good news is we're doing a lot better. Smoking rates are way down across the world. People are living longer, healthier lives. There are so many things where we're having improvements on, but then there's things where we're still going not in good directions. The global Alzheimer's plague is just getting worse and worse and worse, and nobody knows why. My mother's actually dying of Alzheimer's, but I wish there was something we could do about that with thorium. But I think there is going to be something we can do with thorium about cancer. If you know anybody who's had cancer or you've suffered from cancer, you know it can't come fast enough. Many of you know about the relationship between the thorium fuel cycle and the production of targeted alpha therapy medicines. This is something that we may know about and get excited about, but we need to tell the world about this, because as they learn about this, they're going to realize how special and unique it will be to be able to make cancer-fighting medicines using thorium reactors, and how that connection can't be broken. We really have to have thorium reactors if we're going to be able to make these special medicines. And that moment is getting closer and closer all the time. These messages are beginning to percolate to the highest levels of power. I can speak particularly from the US government perspective, but I also know that this is happening in other countries as well. They're beginning to understand that this isn't just an energy solution. It can be a medical solution. It can be a solution that supports agriculture. It can be a solution that supports water supplies. It can be a solution that supports the destruction of nuclear waste, the elimination of nuclear weaponry, the promotion of international peace. All of these good things can come out of the understanding and development of the thorium fuel cycle. And that is a very, very compelling and exciting thing. Thanks to your efforts, things really are changing. Now, I go to a lot of meetings at the Department of Energy, and I'll tell you something I've noticed happening just in the last year or two. It is starting to become the case that when you talk about advanced energy, they are now thinking about molten salt reactors. That was not the way it was. Even very recently, they're starting to think about that. They're starting to have that paradigm shift. Now, the bad news is nobody yet is talking about thorium, but I am seeing changes, and I'm thinking, well, if we could get them this far, it's not going to be much longer before we're getting them thinking about thorium too. 10 years ago, no, it was 2010. I think, Sid, you were at this meeting, the FHR meeting at Oak Ridge in 2010. And I remember I said, how come nobody here is talking about molten salt reactors? I remember somebody tell me, oh, nobody thinks about that. Nobody thinks about that. Well, just a few months later, Andreas had the very first thorium energy conference in London. And oh, what a great meeting that was. And I really see that time as the nucleation of so much of this international effort to support this optimistic future that we can see around thorium.
We've been in business now for 7 years, and funding's always been our hardest challenge. It still remains the limiting effect in all this. We've had a little more success recently. This has to do with the recently announced Department of Energy grant, $2.6 million. Our partner is the Pacific Northwest Nuclear Laboratory. We are super excited to be working with PNNL. I think Paul Brett is still, right there in the front row. All right. So I'm working for Paul for the next couple of years. We're really, really excited. I can't say enough good stuff about the guys and gals at PNNL. Some great chemistry out there, some great understanding. They have developed a technology around nitrogen trifluoride. And nitrogen trifluoride, I think, may solve one of the central problems we faced in the chemical processing of molten salt fuels, which is the aggressiveness of molecular fluorine. So we're nitrogen trifluoride for the extraction of uranium from a molten salt. Now, if anybody's working with fluoride salts, it's really, really important to make sure your salts are kept purified. You've got to keep oxides and sulfides out of the salt, even when you're doing experiments. Otherwise, you're going to get bad results. If this NF3 technology can work out, this can become the new de facto standard for the purification of molten salts, or molten fluoride salts, I should say. So I think this is work that's going to not just benefit our concept, but could benefit just about everybody who's working in this arena.
I know that many of you are young and at an early stage of your career, and I want to encourage you that there are exciting wonderful developments for you to work on. There are discoveries to be made. We've just scratched the surface. We've just begun. And again, thank you so much for having me here.